students, continuing to the chapter Vivid Picture of a Contemporary India. Making the nation competitive. The men who have changed the universe have never accomplished by changing officials but always by inspiring the people. It has become fashionable in the 90s to talk of a national competitive advantage. Not just business, but even politicians and the brokerates increasingly began to use the phrase. While this is a useful concept, it is easy to fall into the mercantile trap of believing that the nation competed in the global market and the policy maker determined market share. The truth is that the only companies competed and they will win or lose share based on their capables. When a critical mass of firms in a specific industry for a particular nation is repeatedly successful in the world markets and help us to generate sizable export earnings, then the nationals is loosely termed to be the competitive in that particular industry. There is no one-on-one competitions between the national states. During the 90s, we were influenced in India by the American debate on strategic trade. Some Indians enthusiastically read the tracts like Robert Richer's Works of a Nation and Lister Head to Head, and we began to view India as a giant corporation competing with the other countries in the global marketplace. Our media picked up the phrases India in and began to use it widely, and the Swadeshi jargon Manch, the richest protogenistic organization allied to the BJP, tried to pursue the government to the tragic specific industries and lend them support. Government can help the companies to become competitive by the sensible fiscal and monetary policies and investment in the social and the physical infrastructure, political stability, law and order and the other responsive legal system all make a country and a good place to do the business and contribute to the national competitiveness. But direct interventions by the government in order to help the industry is a general counterproductive, inefficient and often inducious. We have learned this lesson painfully in India through all the years of a license permit Raj. But even the richer countries that try to interference in the name of the industrial policy usually failed. Years ago, the European lost millions in an European economic community. Attempts to create the competitiveness in the high definition television. The Japanese lost the billions of yen in a government inspired program to enter into a mainframe computers. The lesson is that the government would be the last to find out. Thus, the notion of the targeting an industry is a fraudest with the problem and should be to create a and should be avoided. What is important? The competitiveness is for the governments to create a condition that helps or raise productivity is for governments. In the chapter Chicks, I have looked at how our companies could become competitive. These chapters bring together a number of essays on how a government can help create nations' competitiveness in the post-reform age. The first essay introduces the notion of a nation competitive advantages. The school second seeks to the learning lesson from the China on competitiveness in a number of areas. The third reminds us the military forces cannot be sustained unless it is backed by the economic strength. Finally, two short pieces. The first verse is on the competition bill. The second is about the trade off between the environment and jobs. The enemy is inside. Once in a while, a book come along that no not only influences the minds of the policy makes, but it creates a new vocabulary for the discourse. The Competitive Advantage of the Nation by Michael Porter was such a book. A nation in prosperity does not grow only because of its natural endowment, its labor pool, its interest rates, or its currency values. As a classical economic insists, it grows out of the capacity of its industries to innovate and upgrade, says the Porter. A national can thus create competitive advantage when its firms insulate themselves from competitive through the technology or service based on the prosperity skills of their employee. Simply having an educated workforce as India does, it is not enough. The skill of the workforce must be applied to its exporting industries in order to gain nation competitive advantage. Successful exporting nations have always had intensively competitive homemakers, and robust competitions is the school in which industries learn to succeed, because it creates a demanding customer who continually push companies to improve quality. India failed to understand this, and its greater mistake was to virtually eliminate competition in its domestic markets. Until 1991, our licensing policy restricted domestic competition. FERA and the high tariffs inhibited foreign competitions. The monopolies and the restrictive trade practices, that is MRTB Act, which was meant to foster competitions, usually had the opposite effects because it slipped a firm merely on the account of the size. Porter gives many examples of how intensive competitions in the domestic markets lead to the global competitiveness. Local rivalry with the countries led America, software, and the hard companies to the global leadership. In Japan, frees competitions among 112 machine tool manufacturers, 25 makers of music steerers, 15 camera producers, and 9 car companies also lead to the global success. 10 years after the reforms, many Indian markets still do not have the start of vigorous competition that will teach our companies to become world players. The Porter second determination of the nation advantage is the ability of a success local companies to create a network of top classes suppliers and ancillaries, somewhat in the way that Maruti has done in India. He illustrates this with the example of the Italian footwear industry, where shoes producers interact closely with the leather products on a new textures and colors, list the shoes still on their drawing boards. Leather products in turn gain yearly insights into a fashion trends because of this yearly dialogues. The question is how do Indian companies expects to compete and gain market shares in the global market. Initially, it is born to be on the primitive basis of a factor accumulation, the way all the developing countries starts with a cheaper labor and a raw material, and our present exporters of undifferentiated products are based on this advantage. But this is also makes them vulnerable to the shifting exchanges rate of our competitions and the competitions from even lower wages countries. Gradually, Indian industries will rise to a second stage and become strategic minded rather than the opportunities. Our companies will focus on excelling in one area of the business rather than being a jack of all trades. Today, the average India business house is still engaged into many business activities. They will seek out more sophisticated customers and highly value added segments of the market. Rather than make generic products, they will invest in upgrading human capital and the technological resources, establishing a formal in-the-house R&D programs and restructure works practices in order to raise the productivity. Although industries will have accumulated modern technology, it will still compete in a low price segments with a heavy reliance on foreign components, machineries and the customers. This is a stage at which South Korea and the Taiwan are at the moment. Eventually, at the third stage, Indian industry will have to driven by the innovations if it had to become a world class. It will have to assume technology and process leadership. Japan and Germany are at this stage. Indian companies will also have to get bigger to be more competitive. Only large companies will be able to sustain investments in R&D, match the marketing resources and global distribution capabilities of world scale competitors, and be able to divert huge resources to training and upgrading of their employee skills. Smaller companies will largely play the role of auxiliaries or suppliers to the larger companies. In Japan, Sony, Panasonic, and the Toshiba routinely leverage the innovations of their component supplies into the global market. Microsoft and the Intel achieved global leadership on the both shoulders of IBM. The success of the Silicon Valley companies depends on AT&T and Motorola. The poorer role of the government in creating competitive advantage is a catalyst. The government cannot create a competitive industry. Only companies can do that. But governments can encourage or even push companies to raise their sights. They can promote sustained investment in in human skills and the innovations through a fiscal policy. They can ensure the competitions by reducing state and private monopolies, removing the price control and lowering the tariff and trade barriers. Ultimately, it is a company leadership that achieves the global advantage. A good company chief resources recognize that the central role of a change and the innovation and the unforgettable truth that innovation grows out of a pressure and challenges. This has a rich implementations grow out of a pressure and challenge. This has a rich implementation for our educational policy. How do we get our best talent into export industries like tea, gem cutting, leather, ready-made garments and softwares? If we value exports, then we must attach the prestige and rewards to the working in them so that the young talent will be attracted to them. A Porter says that nations tend to be successful in activities and industries that people admire or depend on the activities from which the nation heroes emerge. Japan heroes work for Tokyo, Sony and Honda. German heroes work for BMW, Audi and Mercedes. While we did not have a national heroes in our traditional exporting business, we did begin in the 90s to make sure our software warriors into national icons. People like Narayana Murthy and Premji increasingly became the role model for the young. This is a welcome development. Indians are among the brightest people on the earth, said a German statement in an candid situation at Davos in the early 90s. And yet India can't seems to take advantage of the global economy. Why can't Indians understand that there is only one game in town? Those who learns to play it well will make it in 21st century. Others will be left behind. The game is of course, exports, and no nation in the modern times has grown rich or economically strong without becoming a successful world traders. India's finest economic year since independence were between 1993 and 1997. It is not surprising that the export also blossomed, increasing 20% a year during the period. India and China had the same level of exporting in 1974, around $13 billion. By 2000, China export have crossed $200 billion and India were languishing below $50 billion. The trade numbers, more than anything else, explains why the world respect China and ignore India. By now, most people have realized that East Asian miraculous success was built on exports. But few realizes that to be a top exporters, you have to be a top importers. The world top 10 exporting nations are also the world's top 15 importing nations, and virtually in the same order. According to WTO data, this makes sense. The more output you want, the more input you need. Since no countries make everything or should make everything, they import them. India has always been a bitterly analogetical to imports. To begin with, we always had a very high tariffs. Then we treated an importer as someone akin to a crook and placed the most terrible hurdles in his or her way. But we have always allowed imports for export purposes, saying as the brokerage. That's true theoretically, but our systems and the procedures are so hostile to import that they break the back of any honesty exporters. One back broken, exporters told me a few years ago. Only stupid people will export from India. Most Indians cannot begin to fathom how we have suffered from reserving around 800 industries and product for the small scale industries sectors, that is SSI. Our policy rewards a small manufacturers for remaining a small and prevents him from achieving economic scale. Ironically, Chinese small industries is sweeping the world because their policy encourages them to mechanize, grow and become large. Foreign buyers give credits and take equality in small Chinese firms and focus them on exports. What was reserved for the small scale sectors or simple products such as garlands, toys, shoes, etc. These are preciously the one where we have competitive advantage with our cheap labors. The East Asian countries started by exporting these products and built their export miracles on their back. While the global economy needs these products in a very large quantities, the Indian exporters were not allowed to make and sell a large volumes. Large volumes need large machines and they exceeds the capital cost limits allowed by the law to the small scale sectors. Hence, our exporters became an unprofessional bunch while in our competitors' nation, which encourages the economics of the scale, exporters or large professional companies. This explains why we don't find a big name such as Tata, Birla, or Ambani's in the export business. Once brokerage will retort that an exporter is expected from small scale industry limits if he gives export guarantors. True, but this is flawed logic. It shows ignorance of the ground reality of law, how you bind a business. The fact is that you must not separate domestic and export business in this manner. As a porter have pointed out, companies learn to grow and become strong through robust competitions in the domestic markets, and only thus do they gain confidence to compete in a slavish competitive world markets. If you disbar them from selling in the domestic markets, they will never learn to compare. When I was a Procter & Gamble India, we tried and failed to make India a sourcing base for one of our projects for the whole of Asia. The cost of the high technology machines needed exceeded the small scale industries. Inverse limit of $500 million in a potential exports were lost to India. For these and the other reasons, Abid Hussain Committee recommended the scrapping the small scale reservation policy. This has finally begun to happen and few industries have been de-reserved in the recent year. But it in the case of a too little too late. Meanwhile, China exports of toys, garments and the small scale appliances have risen for $3 billion in 1985 to $70 billion in 1997, whereas ours has gone from $2 billion to $14 billion in the same period. According to 1996 World Investment Report, as much as one-third of all trade now takes place with the transnational firms, and the other third between the transnationals and the other companies. The bulk of the work trade is not the export and the import of finished goods but a highly complex exchange of the components among the subsidiaries of multinational companies based in different countries. Data from the United Nations Council for Trade and Development UNCTAD shows that American multinational exported 40% of the sales of their subsidiaries in 1993. It was as high as 60.4% from developing countries of Asia and 84.9% from Malaysia. However, it was only 4.1% from India. Multinationals do not export from India because our systems and the procedure for imports are largely anatomistic to rapid turnaround time. The multinationals requires to satisfy both internal and external customers. The multinational companies are willing to put up with our inefficiencies when it comes to the domestic makers, but they won't risk their global business to the uncertainties of our red tape, corrupt customs officials, congested ports, and the unorganized dock labours. Havel Packard, that is HP, seriously looked at India in the mid 90s for a globally sourcing prints head for its inkjet printers, but it picks Malaysia instead because it was more reliable. HP wanted a turnover time of 24 hours from order of a shipment. The best could India was 5 days. It is surprising that we are a failure as an exporting nation. It is self-initiated defeat caused by our policies and the procedures. If India wants to win the game and become a successful exporter, it must further reduce duties and non-tariff barriers. It must scrap all the small scale industries reservation. It must improve infrastructure, especially port handling. It must cut red tape and discipline custom officials. Only thus will it become a better place to do business. Outstanding talent is a scarce in our nation, and a nation's success depends on the type of the education its talent people chooses where they decide to work and the efforts and the commitments. If we want to succeed in the world market, it is obvious that we must get some of our best talents in our exporting enterprises. We export mainly ready-made garments and the textiles, leathers, goods, gem and the jewelries, low-ended engineering products as tea and the softwares. These are the products of a sweet shop, except the software, and our competitive advantage seems to lie in our low wages. As I have pointed out, our policy of reserving simple, labor intensive manufacturer for the small scale sectors ensure that our exports belongs to generally to the small, unorganized and often unprofessional enterprises. It is hard to imagine these enterprises being able to attract real talents, let alone top MBAs, expect perhaps as interpretation partners. Yet every exporters I have spoken to complain about the difficulties of getting good people. So how we get our exporters to attract talents? Every exporter sectors have an industrial association. If an industrial association and a better institutions of management could come together, and if the latter could adopt one export industry which is local to its area, then we might be able to create a contact for a talent. For example, the Indian Institute of Management, that is IIM, Ahmedabad, might adopt gem cutting since it is primitively Gujarat based. The Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, that is IIFT, might adopt the ready-made garment industry which has a large base around Delhi. IIM Kolkata might adopt a tea which is based in the east, while IIM Bangalore could adopt the software industry. These are merely examples, and the institutions other than IIMs might in fact be more situated for this purpose. What do I mean by adoption? I mean the management schools would set up in close collaborations with the adopted industry, training programs and the courses that are relevant to the particular export industry. Industry in turn would send its people to teach an institute as a guesty faculty, and it develops employees to be trained in the later skills and in upgrading their knowledge and related to the industry. The schools would also become a source of a fresh, talented young people who join the industries and make a career in it. It may not be a management graduate, it could even be a technical whom the industries would welcome for the basic skills and the commitment they brought to their jobs. Industry might argue that they already have their own specified institutions. This is true, but the majority of these institutions are of indifferent standards and are launchings. In the end, adoption by top schools may not guarantee the higher quality, but I reckon the chances of a success will be greater. If a work, then in course of a time, the adopted institutions will create a knowledge base that our rival will find difficult to imitate, and it will provide the industry with a sustainable competitive advantage. Obviously, the ability of the industry is to attract students and technicians, and the track records of the graduates will determine success in the end. Management industries will argue that the bright young MBAs will not be attracted to our hole in the wall export shops. They may be right, but if there is a commitment to the idea, there will be a plenty of creative solutions as institutes work in a partnership with the industries. If MBA graduates are not the answer, it may be more appropriate to work with a different pool of students, perhaps older persons with experience in the exports, and train them to become interpretation partners of exciting exporters. And you will need a curriculum that prepares managers to become entrepreneurs with special skill related to the specific export industries. Eventually, with a persistence building up of a knowledge and a skill base specific to the industry, our export companies will, one hope, begins to innovate and upgrade themselves and slowly gain market shares. Exporters, I think, should welcome the highly specialized educations and a growing pool of talent. The management institution too will benefit by getting a world class reputation in a specialized area. The country will obviously gain through rising competitiveness and rising exports. This is a model of a University of California at Davis, situated in the California wine country. It is set up the world leading centers of a winemaking research and the talents in occupation with the local wine industry. This research institution provided the California wine industry a major competitive advantage as it swept the world market in the 80s and early 90s and became one of the best in the world. Porter cities the example of Denmark, which have two hospitals that treat and study diabetes. And it is no wonder that Denmark has been the world leading exporters of the insulin. Similarly, Holland have premier research institution in cultivating, packing and shipping flowers, a field in which Holland is the world's leader. We have to remember that the competitive advantage of a nation is not general to its entire industry. It is specific to a few industries. Even the most successful nations have only a few industries where they enjoy the global market share. The rest of their industries are weak and globally uncompetitive. Therefore, it is important to focus on those industries where we already enjoy a competitive advantage, and the challenges is how to increase a advantage over time. Ignore Pakistan, heed China. A few years ago, a respected head of a multinational company observed that the unreal quality of our public discourse. He said that he had read our newspaper variously for 2 weeks, and for every report on China, he has counted 8 on Pakistan. To the world at a large, only China and the India matter in Asia, he said. When people says that the 21st century will belongs to Asia, they have China in the mid and then India. Japan doesn't count because its demographics are wrong. The Pakistan does not even exist in the big picture. Although China is a currently ahead, India is the only country they could counterbalance it. I realize Pakistan is your neighbor, but so in China. Listening to him, I was remembering of one of a sage, Patanjali says, "What a man think, so he becomes." Patanjali was referring to controlling our thoughts during meditation, but what is true for an individual is also true for a nation. We are obsessed with the Pakistan, and so we will become the like a Pakistan, a failed economic and a political state. Instead, we should engage with China, the most dynamic economic in the world for 2 decades. Pakistan is a distraction and pulls us down. China will pull us up. What can China teach us? The first lesson is to have a clear national objective. For 20 years, China has been only objective to become an economic superpower and lift its people out of poverty, and it is pursuing its single minded. Nationals like individuals perform best when they are one pointed. The Chinese have learned the law and the order, speedy judge, political stability, all goods in themselves. Also promote the growth by creating a sound climate for investment. The Chinese leader wake up in the morning and they think that only one thought, the prosperity of the people. What do our leaders think out? The New York Times reported in January 2002 that there were 5 Chinese delegations in Bangalore in the previous month alone. Trying to understand India's success in software, they have beaten us in everything. Now they also want to defeat us in software. The CEO of the Indian company who have refused the Chinese entry into his premises, we quoted and saying, Premier Zhu visited Bangalore the same month to woo India companies to come to China. He went to Delhi not to talk about Akshi China or Pakistan, but to establish a Belgian Indian airlink. Foreign investment has been the fuel behind the Chinese miracle, reported the Wall Street Journal. Every dollars of a foreign investments yield $5 of additional output to the Chinese economy. That compares with these that $2 in the state-owned sectors. More than 50% of the China's phenomenal exports come from foreign enterprises. Even assuming that 70% of the Chinese FDI is from non-residential Chinese, the 30% that it is not in 4 times larger than ours. Yet India and are the one who fears foreign investment. Our concerns over Swadeshi reflects our inferiority complex and our lack of confidence in our ability to compete in the global marketplace. How did the Mauritius insular Chinese manage to change their attitude to foreign capital? China releases for more than we do to the enormous potential of a global capital for creating wealth and eliminating poverty. That is why it is wrong it with much great vigorous and effectiveness. Once investors come to China, they are more hospitality treated by the government. The Chinese government also targets specific multinational companies and goes after them single minded. This is the second lesson China can teach us: how to get more foreigners' investment. Why China is growing so fast is a result of a phenomenal rise in a labor productivity. According to a study by Ziulin Hu and Moshin Khan of the International Monetary Fund, they trace that only not only to the foreign enterprises but also to the Chinese town and the village enterprises, which have drawn more than 100 million people from lower productivity agriculture into higher value added manufacturings. Started initially as simple agriculture processing factories, many are now world class exporters. China's reformers started from below, unlike ours, and the third lesson was we can learn is to shift the focus of our reforms on the agriculture and the village. Another secret of Chinese productivity is flexible labor law. The Chinese are able to hire and fire workers based on their customers' demand. Chinese workers in state enterprises are routinely punished for indisciplines. This is not possible in India. Even when a public sector's enterprises company is sick and has stopped production, the workers earn full salary. Hence, a fourth lesson is of reform our labor laws. There are many more lessons, but first let us decide as a nation to ignore Pakistan and heed China. Every Indian leader should scrawl China as a big letter in his office to remind him every day who is our real competitors. While China is currently ahead, it is also who is our 12 years head started in economic forum. Our economy has performed well in the past 2 decades, and we accelerate our reforms, especially in the agriculture and the education, we will gain ground. If we do not, then China is going to push us around and humiliate us in the 12th first century. What makes a global investor decide to invest in a particular country? When I was a member of an operational committee of a Procter & Gamble between 1991 and 1994, I had an opportunity to observe the dynamics of the investment decisions of a major global investors with the operation is more than 50 countries. I learned that what made China and India attractive to the multinationals is primarily a growing middle class. China's consuming class is far bigger than India and it is better off. And this is partially because China has a head start in reforms and it has been growing faster. Both societies also have a lively interpretational classes which knows the commercial game. This class is a potential partner of a multinationals in distributions, in supplying the raw and the packing materials, in wholesaling, retailing and in a contract manufacturing. India's advantage over China or the privilege of English and the global economy rewards those who know it. India has also built up flourishing capital market which is capable of raising ample local funds if needed. India has often opened the democratic government since independence with a record of orderly suggestions. Finally, the Indian judicial system is an asset even though it is extremely slow. These advantages are well known. However, there is one factor that is less well appreciated. In this decision to invest in detergent in India, Procter & Gamble was present here and had a strong market position. Being absent from what are positioned potential the two largest market in the world, they realized would put them a disadvantage in the long term. In short, the hunt for the global market shares in a strong driving forces in the investment decision. The question is why, despite these asserts, has India not been able to attract the foreign investment in the 90s when smaller countries in Asia were far more successful? We received less than 1% of the world's foreign investment. Our biggest disadvantage over China is the attitude of our bureaucracy. I have worked in 6 countries and now here in the world is bureaucratic red tape as big a hurdle as in India. Corruptions exist in many countries, but nowhere is it an ineffective. In the words of one foreign investors, the Indian bureaucracy seems to take a sadistic pleasure in stopping enterprises. We can also learn the Chinese to shed our exophonic attitude to the foreign investors. Our Swadeshi activities demands that we be selective about the foreign investment, and this on the face of it appears to be reasonable. But the Chinese have realized that the appears to be responsible. But the Chinese have realized that the investment world does not work that way. Foreign investors suffer for a herd mentality and act on their market sentiments. Before deciding to invest in a distinct land, they want to know that whether the investment will be safe. So, when they view the attacks on Pepsi and the Kentucky Fried Chicken on their television screens, as it has happened in the mid 90s, everyone became concerned. The Chinese have realized that the foreign investors are not lined up outside the doors waiting to come in. The brutal reality of the global market is that a demand for the capital is greater than its supply. Global capital goes where opportunities are commensurate with risk and are competitive with the alternate options. Indian capitals behave no differently. Why does its folks to Mumbai and Bangalore and ignore Patna? The harsh truth in India is that India is a global capital what Bihar is to India capital. We need foreign capitals more than it needs us. We need a massive amount of fund to upgrade our creaky infrastructures, and neither our governments nor our private industries has these sort of resources. Hence we have to wow the foreign investors. With our poor imagine, we have to work harder. With the reforms, we have signaled to the world that India has opened up. But we are not in a position to say yes, but thus we cannot be selective. We cannot be a half pregnant. Even if we could be selective, there are a good news reason why we should not be. The point is, who would be the selecting on what basis? As soon as we give the power of selecting to a politicians or a brokerist, we risk returning to the bad old days of the license permit Raj. To minimize the corruption, it is the best to be transparent and not give a disemperity powers to anyone. Besides, by being selective, we give our industrialists another excuses to demand protection for various products and risk becoming a closed economy gain. I am an admirator of Mahatma Gandhi, but his Swadeshi ideology was badly flawed. as a political tactics to galvanize the India against the British rule, Swadeshi served its purpose at the time. But an economically philosophy in today's competitive, borderless economy, it is self-destructive. The record of the past 50 years where AMP shows that the country that were open and encouraged the foreign investments have constantly outperformed those which were closed, and none of it lost its sovereignty. The tiny Singapore builds a strong economy based on foreign investments. Today it is regular lectures the United States on a moral value and the superiority of the Confucian's ethics. So, why is a big country like India afraid? Let we forget we did sincerely try to participate Swadeshi for 40 years until 1991. And what was the result? We ended up producing high cost, shoddy goods. As we lost confidence in our ability to export, we became deficient. Swadeshi buried in us a third world feeling of inferiority and dependency. Equally harmful in Swadeshi thinking is the perception that someone should have tell me what it is good for me. Speaking for myself, I did not eat Kentucky Fried Chicken because I am vegetarian, but I don't deny the freedom to another India to eat what he likes. Millions of the Americans don't eat junk foods, but they don't stop others because they believe it is a small prices to pay for once. I am distrustful of a people who tell me that what it is good for me. For instance, for 40 years we were told that the telephones were luxury. Lurking deep in the Swadeshi mind, in a Chinese style, commands mentally, which ultimately wants to build an authorization society. I am more and more convinced that an open economy is our ticket for the freedom, and while Swadeshi is the road to slavery. Although we don't wish that to import the commands mentally of our Chinese leadership, we ought to learn that from the Chinese to be more enthusiastic about the market. I sometimes ask myself, why is that so many Indians, especially intellectuals, hate the market? There may be two reasons. I think one, there is no one in the change in the market economy, and this causes because enormous necessity. The second reason is that we tend to equate the market with the businessman. Since we think that the businessmen are crooked, we tend to transfer this negative image to the market, and we feel that the need for the heavy heart of the government to keep the market in line. Because the market is invisible, nothing anyone can say will convince people that the market is morally blind. That is merely an arena in which people buy and sell. We forgot that the market is in fact the best ally of the ordinary citizens because it forces businessmen to compete. It is like the democracy in this respect which forces politicians to compete. This suspension of making is magnified when it comes to the global marketplace, for truly no one is in change there. And for this reasons, multinational companies and the foreign financial institutions became obvious targets. And to diminish the necessity, we take comfort in the familiarity of Swadeshi objects and the protonism. Although we see today the wondrous spectacles of thousands of the young Indians starting new businesses ventures all around us, the idea their struggles for personal gain might actually promote the good of the whole society is to brace for the more people. No wonder Samuel Johnson said that there is nothing which requires more to be illustrated by philosophy than trade does. Even my mother, who thinks that the socialism was the work of a devil, believes in fair prices and decent wages. Although she accepts that people must earn vastly different salaries in order to give incentive for the performances. She complains that there is now too much of greedy in our society. Like most educated Indians, she doesn't think that, as I do, the better results will be achieved if the people shamefully follows their self-interest in the bazaars rather than a frosty moral principles. Criticisms write much nonsense about the technology of multinational companies, which they says that keep Indians from permanently dependent. It is the usual gibberish for the overactive minds of a dependency school, which has no basics in the real world and shows a total lack of understanding of how companies operate. A multinational, like any companies, invest in the order to success in the marketplace, and it will employ whatever technology is to take win. If it employs old technology against a competitor with the lastly technology, then it is clearly shoots itself the foot. Multinationals has no interest in the neo-colonial structure. Thank you.